Welcome back to the OSM channel. In today's video I would like to share with you my homemade grapevine trellis. This trellis system consists of 2 anchor points, one anchor point being this rock, the other anchor point being a steel post cemented in the ground. We have 2 uprights, then finally strung in between the components is this 1/8" stainless steel cable. Now let's go over each individual component, how it's constructed, and then we will continue stringing this trellis up with that stainless steel cable. Alright, so this is anchor point number 1. What I've done here, I've taken a piece of 1" by 1/4" flat steel. I bent over the top 3" section over at like a 30-degree angle to alleviate some of the pressure on these anchor bolts. So now it's in line with the cable. Now, how did I secure this onto the rock? Well, I used a hammer drill, masonry bits, and I drilled into the rock maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches, hammered in 2 expanding concrete anchor bolts. And then with these, once you tighten up the nut, there's an element inside those bolts that flares and expands the end of the bolt, therefore preventing it from pulling out. So we have a rock solid anchor right here. Then as for connecting this steel to the cable, we have a quick link, a washer, and the reason I used a washer was because the thimble for the stainless steel cable would not easily go over the quick link, so it's just kind of like an adapter there. And obviously thimble, stainless steel cable, and clamp. Anchor point number 2, we have a piece of 2" square tubing that goes down to the ground about 2 feet, cemented down, welded onto the top of that 2" square tubing is a piece of 2" but maybe 5/16 flat. Drill the hole through the flat, and then connected to that is this. This is the carabiner to a nylon safety harness lanyard. So the lanyard was damaged. I decided to salvage the carabiner, and it's going to work out just fine for this application. So we have connected to that a shackle, a turnbuckle, and then our 1/8" steel cable. The turnbuckle is really important here because it's going to allow us to take the slack out of the system. As for the 2 uprights, they're constructed out of 2" square tubing. I welded on a square cap on the top of the tubing to prevent water intrusion. Each upright initially was 9 foot tall. I cemented them into the ground 2 feet, so they only stand about 7 feet tall. Additionally, how is the cable strung in between the uprights and the anchor points? Well, I used 1/2" nuts, and I welded 5 on, and they're spaced 1 foot apart. So we're going to be able to put 5 cables onto each upright at 1 foot spacing. Now let's continue stringing this cable in between our anchor points. So I'm going to start on the fixed end, then we'll move over to the other side where we have the turnbuckles. So the first thing we need to do is to install a thimble over our rigging point. In this case, it's going to be this washer. Then these are the clamps we're going to be using. Now, as for the nuts, they are 7mm. So we'll take off the nuts, remove the clamp. Now, seating this cable into the clamp can be a little bit tricky. Find it helpful to have a few pairs of pliers on hand. Now that I have the cable seated into one channel on the clamp, I'm going to go back to the thimble, fold the cable over the thimble, try and make a nice tight bend. So once you get the cable seated into one channel on the clamp and have a nice tight bend over that thimble, here's what you do. Here's the trick. Get yourself a 7" vice grip and clamp the cable into that thimble. So that vice grip is holding this stainless steel cable within that thimble, and that allows us to focus all our attention on seating the other side of the cable within this clamp. Once you have the cable at least started, then you can take the pinch plate, put it over the 2 studs, get your nuts, start them by hand. Just keep working the cable down. And we can tighten these two nuts down the rest of the way. That is a nice, strong, clean looking connection. So now it's time to install the cable on the turnbuckle anchor connection point. Now this side's definitely a little bit trickier because we need to try and remove as much slack out of the cable as possible to ensure that the turnbuckle can in fact do its job. So I have the turnbuckle connected to my anchor point, and I also have a thimble installed on my turnbuckle. I've also cut some of the extra cable off the end of the line here. So we're going to insert the cable through the eye bolt and on the thimble. Now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to get this as tight as I can by hand. So I have this cable about as tight as I can get it by hand. I've made a little bend. That bend may stay there, it may not. So what I like to do, I like to take a little Sharpie and mark that bend. So that way when we remove this cable, of course we're going to have to temporarily disconnect the turnbuckle to make this connection, but we can utilize that black Sharpie mark as our reference mark so we can ensure that when we clamp the cable down, that black Sharpie mark is at the apex of the thimble. Now let's disconnect the turnbuckle. Sure that our Sharpie mark is lined up on the apex of the thimble. We'll clamp it down. That cable is now locked within the thimble, and we can go ahead and start making our clamp connection. Now, as for cutting the cable roll I bought was a 200-foot spool, and included with that spool was this cable cutter. So we can just cut off extra cable if we so choose. Just like we missed one. There we are. Reconnect the turnbuckle. So the lower line is the line we just installed, and we have very little slack in that line, and that'll easily be tightened up by this lower turnbuckle. But before we do that, I'm going to install the rest of these wires here. Alright, I just finished installing these 5 lines, and when I tug on each line, there's probably an inch or two of side-to-side slack in each line, and we're very easily going to be able to remove that slack by tightening up these turnbuckles. So let's tighten up these turnbuckles, get these lines a little bit tighter, even though the system probably would be fine just the way it is. Just finished tightening up the cables. I didn't make them super tight, but tight enough as to where there's really not much slack in the lines. One thing I like about working with this stainless steel cable, for one, it's cosmetically pleasing, but additionally, there's really no stretch in these lines. It's pretty static. So for an application like this, it makes it ideal. And the final thing we need to do here is to start training the grapevines onto the trellis. In order to accomplish that, I'm going to use some yellow mason line. Then once these plants get established on the trellis, then I'll cut this yellow line out of there. We should have a really nice grape patch in a year or two here.